Midsummer 907. The man was riding within view of his home. It was due to be attacked by a cousin of his. But he did not care, for his fortress was impenetrable. He was not the lord of the land, however. He soon would be, however. His father, Elfric, trusted him completely. He had even given him the same name as his would-be attacker, his elder, long-dead cousin's name, a family name passed down since Idaho. He hated the name, had grown to hate the name through his father's bitterness. Utad. He called himself Wigger now, and Wigger of Bibbenburg was visiting his own land, being visible to his own tenants, training his own men, as well as those of the palace. However, it was the same figure, there on the horizon. Was it a coincidence he was at the same point on the landscape? Was his appearance at Rest Harrow each time designed? It was the same man who had been appearing in his sight for the last 4 months. Each time, he had watched the figure, then rode away. But, not this time. Wheeling his horse round, Wigger of Bibbenburg bore down on the figure, which did not make any attempt to flee. Osrith's journey to that very spot had been uneventful. Leaving behind her Guthard of Halligwithakland, having extricated a repudiation of their so-recorded marriage, she had followed the line of forts along the Roman wall, stopping first at Burdaswald and praying to her ancestor, then crossing to Vindolanda and Heavenfield, Oswald's great victory against the Welsh, then at Dennisburn, where Oswald's father, Ealdulfrith had lost the crown to Edwin. She had diverted north from the Roman road to Yvering. Jeffrin was what the British called this settlement, at a place where 2 rivers flowed. She had then crossed them, stopping at Ruttenlyn for rest, shelter, drink and contemplation, sheltering in a cave as the monks of Lindisfarne had sheltered, with Cuthbert, home, as Osrith had soon discovered, to Aishe Bear and her cubs. And now, here he was, her brother Utad. Not the pagan sworn to Alftid, no. Her other brother, Utad, born to her uncle and her mother's last act in the world, so it turned out. It was not young Utad's charge towards her, sword out, which unnerved her, though it was a challenge on the edge of her mind, one which she would have to deal with very soon. No, Osrith's nervousness came from her desire for this meeting to go well. Wigger was her brother, too, her last place to visit before returning to Alba, if at all. Constantine knew her well enough. Sainid had accompanied her to the Tuide River border at Candlemas. She had crossed to Caligwillad overland, watching the lie of the land, her land, Northumbria, and she had a letter for Constantine from Guthard. The land was peaceful now. When Danes came, they sailed further south, London and the east, but they got no rest from Edward. The West Saxons were securing land season after season, under the bilateral arrangement with Ethelred. Osrith smiled when she thought about the Lord of Mercia, Ethelflaed's husband. He could have been the next offer, had not Alfred's reputation diminished his skill and defence of his realm. Defence was more necessary to the west, at the Merse and beyond Chester, where the Norse were sailing for refuge, and the chance of land because of Flance Sinner's ruthless policy of burning and starvation. And when they got to Mercia and southern Cumbraland, Alfred's Burr defence policy was achieving the same effect. No, here in Northumbria, the Picts, under their devolved lawholders, the Mormers, created under Constantine's government reforms, were the main borderlands raiders. Her uncle Elfric constantly complained of attritive raids which wore down his people who, once recovered from one season's thefts, found themselves under raid again. She was pursuing this for Constantine. She did not want to get too close. While Osrith had no doubt she would be able to defeat Elfric, she still felt uneasy and renewed her promise to never return to Bibbenburg while Elfric lived, no matter what Wigger had said. And now a horse, carrying her younger brother, was bearing down on her. Utad. Not that he called himself by that name any longer. He had travelled to many exotic places and his warriors came from many lands, and Osrith had watched him ride about Bibbenburg and the wider Northumbria, caring for the land. Now, Osrith watched him charge at her, his sword raised. And Osrith stood her ground, her horse clearly used to battle, and stood passively in his path. Only when it seemed that the only course of action was that he would hammer straight into her did he turn his huge black beast from her path. It whinnied, its front hooves kicking up the peat earth under its feet. Osrith stood firm, her face impassive. "Who are you?" Wigger's demand filled the whole air and land and sea. Osrith did not answer at first, his face stern, lord-like. When she was sure Wigger was entirely sure he knew, she turned to him. "Can you not suspect?" He was so unlike her elder brother. Her younger brother got off his horse, and took her rein. Wigger was darker-haired and more slight, broader-chested. He inclined his head like he had never had to fight for authority. "You are my sister," he said, his voice softer, then laughed with realization, with joy. "Can it truly be you?" He slid from his saddle, taking his rein in one hand with hers, then extending one of his own towards her. Osrith was overcome. She remembered her sneaking into Wessex like a thief, and her slowly deteriorating relationship with Uhtred which had sunk to undisguised hatred. She took Wigger's hand, her boots sinking slightly into Northumbrian soil. "You have returned to Bibbenburg," he declared, as Osrith took a step back. She was no fool, and Osrith drew away, holding her towards Wigger. "Not while your father lives," she declared. But Wigger did not turn away, or put up any protest at her words. Instead, he stood watching her. Could it be true that she had met a member of her family who was being decent to her? Never. But Osrith was prepared to listen. "I hate my father. You have good reason to hate him, it seems," Wigger replied, neither protesting at being held under sword point, nor retaliating. It seemed that he was merely waiting for her to back down, which Osrith did, Buey's hilt not inches from her palm. Then, Wigger offered Osrith her horse's rein. "We shall walk. Where do you sleep?" "Where I can," Osrith replied. She flicked her eyes to the sea. "And your fortress is under threat, do you know?" "My cousin?" he asked, resignedly as they paced the earth eastwards. "Yes. My brother, my other brother." "When?" "Imminently." Osrith looked at her younger brother. But Wigger shook his head. "H has already been. As have the Picts." "Tell me." And the tale came, of the Picts attacking Bibbenburg with no hope of gaining entry as 4 or 5 of Uhtred's men had broken in through the sea gate. "But I killed him." "You killed Uhtred?" Osrith's heart beat faster. This was news. But Wigger shook his head again. "Elfric." Osrith stopped walking, and looked at her brother's face. "Truly? Elfric dead?" It couldn't be possible. Osrith was some years after 40 and, for the entire of her life on God's earth Elfric had been her scourge. "I escaped your father." Her words came, unbidden, unasked for. Wigger listened, silently as she spoke. "I ended up in Alba. I owe the king my life." "Hence your voice," Wigger smiled. "My voice? You sound like someone who has had their neck rolled up their chin, let go and then told to speak English." Osrith turned to her younger brother in astonishment. Then, she laughed, releasing all her emotion, anger, frustration built up in her for so long, released by her brother's acerbic sense of humor. "We share a mother," Osrith said, at length, as they continued to walk towards Bibbenburg. "She was of Vst. Our line goes right back to the Hainoled, to King Urien. Yet, your adopted homeland, the Scots of Alba, will tend to attack Bibbenburg again," Wigger pointed out, inconveniently. "Constantine has a long-held tradition passed on in his family that he wants the land back to the wall." "The land back? It was never part of Pitland to begin with." Wigger looked astonished at King Constantine's outrageous ambition. "I know," Osrith nodded, quietly. "You know a lot." Osrith broke off her walk beside him, and turned to him, blocking his way. "Which makes you the rightful ruler of all of Northumbria," Osrith pointed out. "You have the lineal claim, through Jaitha." Wigger said nothing, to begin with. Then, he looked past Osrith, and to the fortress, once named for one of their ancestors of Idaho. Bibbenburg now looked inviting rather than forbidding now, to Osrith. "Then, I just have to marry again," he mused. And then Wigger told Osrith that, though he had repelled Uhtred, he had taken Ingolfrid and their son. "What hope do I have now?" he asked, more to himself and God, than requiring an answer of Osrith. What purpose my life now? He looked sharply at Osrith. She will be a whore now? My son will be dead. To deny Utad? Osrith proposed, gently. He will never give up, never. To deny me? Why she added that last question, she didn't know. But, it made her younger brother stare at her for a moment. You wish to challenge me to Bibbenberg? Wigger asked, shifting between feet. Maybe it is I to whom it belongs, Osrith ventured. I do not know you well enough to know if you joke, Wigger sighed. What do you wish, little brother? Osrith asked, kindly as they began to move towards Bibbenberg again. What do you wish? I wish to have you hear Constantine's proposal, she replied. Why? Because today, it was a ship of his men, to assess the fortress, to seize your family. Another day it will be Utad, with maybe a larger army. Make no mistake, Edward and Ethelfled have taken on the mantle of their father, to unite the kingdoms of the Angles and the Saxons under a West Saxon crown. Constantine merely wishes a treaty. Under the name of Saint Oswald, with whom ancestors sheltered at Iona and Irion. You know that? Osrith was startled. She imagined her brother as oppressed as she had been at Bibbenberg, cut off from all. Yet, it made sense he had been educated by the Lindisfarne monks. What good was Elfric's ambition for Bibbenberg if he had not prepared his son to rule after him? It gave Osrith grim satisfaction that Wigger's rule was far sooner than her uncle had ever expected. Of course I know our family story, Osrith, Wigger replied, severely. Is it not ironic that Ethelred of Mercia seeks Oswald's body? Ironic that it was Penda who sliced him up to begin with? His grandson, also Ethelred, sent his wife. Osrith, Wigger nodded. Yes, I know. And Elfric was visited by men who wanted Oswald's heart, Wigger explained. Ethelred wants to re-establish independence, Osrith told him. Assuming you wish to retain independence from the West Saxons, he would make a useful ally. He is Utad's cousin, through his mother, and hates him as much as I do. Wigger did not ask Osrith why. She would not tell him, even if he asked. You wish to know if I would part with it? Wigger asked, cleverly. He nodded his head towards the sea. Ethelred is certainly an option worth considering, however, Ethelfled. If she wasn't pursuing Alfred's dream, she and Ethelred would be separated. They live apart and keep separate households, as it is. Yes. Wigger looked intently at his older sister. What would you do? Yes, he repeated. I would give Oswald's heart. But only if it were you recovering our beloved saint, Osrith. He smiled. It would be a kind of symmetry if you were to. This is where I go next, Osrith admitted. Despite Constantine expecting me to return to Alba, I am rejoining the Mercian army and marching with Ethelred to retrieve our beloved ancestor. They walked in silence until Bibbenberg was wholly in view. Beyond it, the Farns, where Saint Cuthbert sought God, and beyond those islands, Lindisfarne. Will you not return with me to our home? And, Wigger broke off when he saw her expression. Osrith held up her hand. Her scar was a white patch on her left palm. It had left her permanently lamed, and she screwed it up, gripping tagged Sikhs as anger surged through her. As I fled, as I rode, I was not yet 11, and your father told his men to fire on me. The words, part of a story, with no real beginning or end, were shared with the wider landscape of Northumbria, accusingly, with Bibbenberg, as if the fortress could have caused it to be otherwise. What did you do? I broke off most of the arrow shaft and rode on, to Lindisfarne. Elfric is definitely dead, Wigger reassured her. I buried him myself. Even if he wasn't then, he will be now. Osrith shook her head, smiling a little at his humor. Then, she looked determinedly at her brother. You should remarry and extend the line. But Wigger shook his head. I would return to the Mediterranean, he replied, sadly. Then who would have the castle? Can you think of no one? This was no empty question. Wigger had a plan. Only Utad, but, Osrith broke off, as her younger brother stared at her, gravely. Me? Wigger nodded. It would guarantee independence, re-establish our natural alliance to Alba, with the Gales. You have contacts, relationships there, and in Mercia. But Osrith shook her head. Not me, Osrith protested. I have no heirs. Yet, you will, one way or another. I am more than 10 years older than you, Wigger. I cannot have children, and even at my age, a woman of my age, and my life. But you will ally with me to keep Uthed from Bibbenberg? He asked. That was it, Osrith knew. He had established her alliance. Her network was now his, and gladly Osrith would give it. Besides, she was going to Mercia. Osrith looked at the cliffs, which she knew so well, the sea and the sand, and the fortress. Bibbenberg. Once her home. She would give it another chance. On God's word, Wigger, I will. 88,888,888. Midsummer 907, Ethelflaed's country estate. The mother of the monastery was in frantic conversation with the abbess Hild, which brought Hild into a state of emergency whereby she hurried about, finally bringing 2 children with her to Ethelflaed's estate at Saltwick. Aethelstan and Sciora had long known one another, so the journey passed pleasantly. They liked Saltwick, and Ethelflaed was always generous to them, with her time, with her hospitality. However, today, she was distracted and left Aethelstan and Sciora in the company of her daughter Elfwin. Whch was no company at all for them. In her rooms maps were laid out. On accosting Hild, Ethelflaed drew her over to them. Hild gave them a good luck, though she could not deduce Ethelflaed's urgency with them. Bibbenberg, she said, simply. Uthed's home? Hild finished. A woman called herself of Bibbenberg, Ethelflaed clarified, pushing a piece of parchment over to her. The title declaration of the fortress. It makes it clear that Uthed was to inherit. It also mentions a daughter. Folded up inside the titles was another, a piece of parchment which named the woman of Bibbenberg, detailing her marriage, long ago, to Guthred Harthknutson. He was clever, the old king of Alba. Domhnall. Ethelflaed tried, the name on her lips. He knew the power of recording events and housing knowledge, just as her father had known it. So that was where the bitch had been, all that time. Very clever. She pushed the documents towards Hild, who peered at them. Ethelflaed looked further on. The parchment buckled at one edge, and was a little damaged, but the name of the woman was indeed written there. Edra. Ethelflaed knew, then. Her father had known. Guthred had married her, SB had fled from Alba, she had fought in both the Wessex and Mercian armies and, grudgingly, Ethelflaed had to admit, had fought incredibly well. Edra? The abbess nodded. Osrith had given her true name to Hild as she brought Bukka's daughter to him. And now Uthed's sister was, by the measure of it, setting herself to the very fortress that was Uthed's by right. She would be there, at Bibbenberg, in alliance with her younger brother, with the Scots on her side, fighting against him, fighting now. She looked grimly back to the parchment again, gratified she had shared the bitch's identity with Hild. It would be a joy to be the one to tell Uthed of his sister.